Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Explore with Vignesh and I. It's been a while since our last episode, but that's only because we've been wanting to put together this episode in a very special manner because it's an artist that's very close to both of us and also a very special artist to the entire field of Carnatic music, and that artist is Srimati T. Brinda.
मनसा विनवे ओ मनसा विनवे ओ मनसा विनवे ओ मनसा इबरू पुकणे विनवे ओ मनसा इबरू पुकणे विनवे ओ मनसा मनसरिगे उमागमुनु मनसरिगे उमागमुनु अदिबालु कुदरा मनसरिगे उमागमुनु अदिबालु कुदरा विनले ओ मनसा इबरू दुगने विनले ओ मनसा నడతలు పనికి రాదు ఈ నడతలు పనికి రాదు ఈ నడతలు పనికి రాదు ఈ నడతలు పనికి రాదు ఈశ్వరకృప కలుగబోదు ఈ నడతలు పనికి రాదు ఈశ్వరకృప కలుగబోదు ధ్యాన భజన ध्यान भजन भगरा गुहारी ध्यान भजन गुहारी नमे ओ मनसा विबरू गणे नमे ओ मनसा.
Srimati T. Brinda was a colossus on the timeline of Carnatic music for many different reasons, for her persona, for so many anecdotes we hear about her, for of course her sheer impact of the music that she's left on generations to come, and I think just the idea of what tradition or lineage means and how she's carried it so lightly on her shoulders and how she's passed that down so effortlessly. So I think in that manner, speaking about somebody like Srimati T. Brinda today is going to be daunting because of course first I have to place a disclaimer that I will be biased in whatever I have to say, but more so because just as her music was so nuanced, each time you listen to an artist like T. Brinda, there are so many more layers that you keep uncovering every single time. And I know a lot of artists say, no, but did she actually think of these layers when she sang? I don't think that matters to us at all. The fact that there are that many layers in the music for us to discover each and every single time, learn from, assimilate and try and incorporate in whichever way it suits our own art aesthetic, I think is great because we don't have too many inspirations that are constantly giving. There are some artists that we listen to over a period of 5-6 years and then we move to the next artist, but then there are some artists where each time we listen to them, it is a learning experience. So I think Srimati T. Brinda is one such artist for me and I'm sure for many others.
Rightly so, like Ritvik said, Srimati T. Brinda is an extremely special artist for the both of us. I started listening to her at a much later stage in my journey. Actually after I moved to Chennai and after I met Ritvik and all my Guru T.M. Krishna and everybody else. So they introduced me to her music and we used to listen to it together. I used to listen to it later on at home alone, and every time we listened to it, every time I listened to it, there was something else. There was some nuance that always I stumbled upon some nuance. Every time we listened to it collectively, there was something that somebody always pointed out that we would have missed while listening to it the previous time. and that's what brings about so many layers in music, so many layers in her music, whether it be Kirtanam rendition or whether it be the Alapna rendition, whether it actually be Neraval and Swaram rendition also. There was something special about the way she sang her gamakas, the way she enunciated lyrics, the way she vocalized her voice. Everything was a layer, and everything was so nuanced. So in that way, this episode is pretty special to the two of us.
Yeah. We'll start off by maybe speaking about some general overall points about her music that I'm sure a lot of you already know about, but just to set some context into the detail that we will then be later going into. So, first, if we speak about nuance, which is a word that we've already, I think, said multiple times through this presentation, nuance, I think, as an idea exists in different things. There can be the nuance of the voice, the nuance of the modulation, the nuance of the gamaka, the nuance of the movement between the notes, the nuance of how you say a certain syllable, the nuance of how all of these come together. And I think all of that makes a very big difference in the overall idea of how her music sounds. So, to go into these many different nuances is going to be difficult because it's extremely detailed, but we'll try and do our best to bring as much as possible. Of course, one thing that you can say for her style of music is that it's a gamaka oriented style of singing. With a gamaka oriented style of singing, what does that actually mean? When you actually look at her music in detail, there are a lot of different varieties of gamakas that she uses. But because of that precise value of the Kampita Gamakam, the moment we think of their music, automatically the first thought that comes to us is the sound of the Kampita or the movement of the Kampita. But what is beautiful is that the way she used Podi Sangadis either through Morikais or Spuritams are very fascinating in terms of how that can be incorporated into a larger majority of Manodharma ideas, especially in raga and swara singing, which we don't see often. But for me, the most fascinating and I think the most breathtaking part about her music is the use of jarus. Jarus is basically a curve from one note to the other, either on the way up or on the way down. But what makes that interesting is the idea of the jaru has always been something that's been closely linked or associated with Hindustani music. And even in our compositions, you would find a lot of jaru usage in compositions of Muthuswami Dikshidhar, probably lesser in Tyagaraja Swami Kirtanams, but quite a fair amount in Shama Shastri Kirtanams as well. But then when you look at padams and javalis as separate musical ideas, apart from the musical ideas that we get from the compositions of the Trinity, then most of the musical movement that happens within these compositions are all jaru based, which is why it feels like such a task to find a place to breathe in them, because the jaru keeps the continuity of the music going. And what that does is that also it provides very different takeoff points from one region to the other. So you're not stuck in one region. The jaru automatically gives you an opening to move to another region or another octave or to another note that is the life of the raga, and then from there you can continue the melody. So I think jaru creates a lot more possibilities in different ways than what we are used to in Carnatic music, and somebody I think who explored that to a vast extent is Brinda. I don't think after her or even before her we ever saw that glorious a usage of the jarus. I mean, I am going to be using a lot of superlatives because I don't know how else to describe it, but then the moment you see or hear one jaru, even before you're able to, I think, take that in, you will already find that she's moved on somewhere else, and from there it's gliding somewhere else. And I think the beauty of that flow and the beauty of that movement is very special. And again, jaru being a type of gamaka, for that to be incorporated into her overall aesthetic of music is, I think, fascinating.
Yeah, also from my understanding, what I think is, for her, the swara also itself was not just a swara and that she is embellishing it with something else. The whole movement was the swara itself. The swara encompassed the movement that she was singing. So if she was singing a Gandharam or a Madhyamam or a Nishadam with that Kampita Gamaka or with the Jaru or with a Vali or you know, a Vali is a Gamaka that encompasses 2 or 3 swarams together. So, but that movement was that swara, and that swara was in the context of the raga, and when you hear her sing it, it's just that movement, and you can't actually pinpoint you can't actually pinpoint a swara, or you know, try and notate it, or you know, all kind of analytics that we may want to apply on it, but it's that composite sound, and that composite sound is the beauty of the music, beauty of Carnatic music that was brought out by her music too. So,
yeah, and I think one thing that's important to say here is knowing her dislike towards analyzing music so much. I think the fact that we are doing this to her music is something that she might not be too happy about, but nevertheless it comes from a place of passion, so we'd like to place that on record as well.
I mean, it also comes from a place of wanting to understand what's there. I mean, as a generation, I think we try and decipher even something like even something so abstract as her music.
Absolutely. I think it's also about understanding some of the past and sharing that with, I think, peers, because of which then we all have certain different more pathways to move towards, which is powered by the understanding of the history and I think the practice of this art form. And I think that's very important for the art form to keep continuing to grow and move forward.
Yeah, actually, when we say this, there is a small speech by her, like a talk that one of her students would have arranged, and she would have spoken to her students. She would have spoken about theory and theorizing Carnatic music, and we can maybe listen to that.
சங்கீதங்கிறது வேற, தீரிங்கிறது வேற. தீரிங்கிறது சரிய படிச்சுட்டு சும்மா சரிகம தனிசா சரிகம தனிசா சாணிதம கரிசா அப்படி சொல்லிட்டு பாடிட்டு இருந்தா பாடுறதுக்கு பிராக்டிக்கலுக்கு அது உதவாது. ஏதோ பரீட்சை எழுதணும், தீரி எழுதினாதான் பாஸ் பண்ணுவா, இல்லாட்டி ரொம்ப நாங்கள் காலேஜில் ரொம்ப சிரமப்பட்டுருக்கோம், உனக்கு தெரியும். தீரியை வச்சுட்டு புக்கா வச்சுட்டு அவளுக்கு பிராக்டிக்கல் பாடுறதுக்கு முடியாத போய் ரொம்ப சிரமப்பட்டுருக்கா காலேஜில் எல்லாம். தீரைங்கிறது மரசுந்தரகுனி சரீவர தனிசா நித பகம தனிசா. என்ன ராகம் அது? இல்ல என்ன ராகம்? வேடினே பாட சம சீசுலே வரசு தரகுடி சரீவர வேடின பாட சம சீசுலே. இது நன்னா இருக்க, காதுக்கு எது நன்னா இருக்கு சொல்றது? வேலின பாட சபீசுல வரசு ஒரு ஹார்மோனி மாதிரி ஆயிடும். சானித மதனி சானித மதனி சானித பமக இப்படி ஆயிடும் அந்த ஜாவடி. அதனால சீரை ஏதோ ஒரு அளவுக்கு வச்சுண்டு அது எது நமக்கு ரொம்ப ரொம்ப கனராகங்கள்ல ரொம்ப அதுல பிரயோகங்கள் வராது. அதோட கூட ஜாவளிங்கிறத அதை அவ தீரையை முக்கியமா வச்சுட்டே ஜாவளி பண்ணல, மிஸ்ரம்னு வச்சுட்டு தான் பண்ணிருக்க. முனு நனு கலசி மம மூலரிகிலசி ஏ மந்துன முதுபால மணிகி நெனமந்துன முனு நனு கலசி மம மூலரிகிலசி முனு நனு கலசி மம மூலரிகிலசி. இது பேர் தான் மிஸ்ரம் பேர். இது எதுக்காக காதுக்கு சௌக்கியமா இருக்கிறதுக்கு தான் ஜாவடி பண்ணிருக்கு. கேத்திரிய பதங்கள் பாடினா ரொம்ப சவகம் காலத்துல இருக்கிறதுனால ஒரு ஜாவடி ஒரு வேகமா பாடினா காதுக்கு எது நன்னா இருக்குமா அதுதான் தீரி. அதனால இந்த தீரையை பிடிச்சிட்டு ரொம்ப சிரமப்படாத எல்லாரும் அந்த டயத்தெல்லாம் பிராக்டிக்கல்ல சங்கீதத்துல நிறைய யூஸ் பண்ணி நன்னா பாடினா ரொம்ப நன்னா இருக்கும்னு என்னோட உத்தேசம்.
Of course, like everybody knows, another very, very important aspect of her music that we need to learn from, and for her also it was very important, was her Shruti Shuddham. And for her, Shruti was supreme. Even if you sing a Brika, even if you sing a Jaru, even if you sing a Kampita, whatever you sing, Shruti Shuddham was paramount. It was not just the Shruti Shuddham for Sapasa. Like every swaram in that gamaka, in that context, in that movement had to be in Shruti. And but she used to say that, you know, if you sing that, you start singing in Shruti itself and then contemplate on what you have to do deeper in music. But the starting point is to start singing in Shruti completely.
Yeah. And I think one of the very interesting things when you listen to her is that you understand that there are layers to understanding what being in Shruti is.
Yeah, exactly.
Because many times when you have a senior artist with you who's probably tuned the tambura for 30 or 40 more years than you have, and you finish tuning the tambura and you think it's in perfect pitch to your ear, and then with a slight tweak they make it sound that little bit more perfect, then you know that that added layer is there. That doesn't make what you've tuned entirely wrong, because it may still sound right to your ears, but then there is still that finer, deeper understanding of what Shruti Shuddham is. And that is something that I think she held very deeply, and we can all listen to that in multiple different occasions when she sings. Because even if when she's singing Swaram, if suppose for a moment she wants to highlight something, there are multiple examples of that. We will also go through that when we speak about Ragam or Swaram in specific, but then there are points where if she wants to bring your attention to something, just after a moment of silence she will hold just a single note, and that single note would suddenly seem like it's in breathtaking Shruti Shuddham. Not that everything before that was not, everything before that would also be, but then just that one extra moment before would pull you in that much closer for you to be able to understand what that refinement of being in Shruti is, which is why I said that there are multiple layers to that understanding, where with more years and experience we all get better at it. And I think somebody who was at the pinnacle of that understanding was Brinda.
Another very important and well-known fact is her repertoire of Padams and Javalis. The entire family, the Dhanama family, right? She's a part of the Dhanama family, and their, what can I say? Their treasure was the Padams and Javalis that they brought down in their lineage. And if not for Brinda, I don't think we would have had a way of had this way of this nuanced way of singing the Padams and Javalis. There have been traditions of singing Padams and Javalis in Kuchipudi, in Andhra Pradesh, and in different traditions of music. But this specific way of singing Padams and Javalis, which with so much importance to Gamakas, with so much importance to the Kala Pramanat, with so much importance to movement and nuance in movement, is for sure completely because of the Dhanama family, and for us through T. Brinda and other members of that family.
Yeah. And I think when we speak of Padams and Javalis, one thing that we can take away from that is the understanding of the raga. Raga as an idea, I think, is multifold, because every composition offers a very different perspective of the same raga. Especially when you look at ragas like Ghanta or Ahiri or Punnagavarali or Gauli Pantu, these ragas where you're generally limited to maybe one or two compositions at a specific Kala Pramana, where then it's far more difficult to gain a nuance from. The fact that there are these Padams and Javalis that exist in ragas like this that offer a much more languid pace and a much more detail oriented idea of how the raga can exist is, I think, a great treasure for us to be able to take from. How we use that in our music is up to each of us, but the fact that that possibility exists because of the existence of Padams, yes, I think is very special and something that we should all treasure.
because the existence of this way of singing the padam also, it's not, we may not know how the composer visualized the sounding of the padam, but the sounding that we receive, the nuance and the raga that we receive from that padam is mostly through their music and the way they have sung it in their family.
Apart from the idea of raga or raga music being very important to them, one other very important component to why their music remains special and relevant and fresh and rich over so many years and across so many people handling and learning and assimilating from the same family is, I think, the idea of discipline and patantara. That is not something that we always attribute to music that we think of as genius, because we think that somehow discipline and being a genius doesn't go hand in hand. But then what is important here is that every time she sang a composition, if you take the same padam across 10 different recordings that are available, you will find every breath, every movement, sometimes even the kala pramanam, every nuance to be exactly the same and nothing left to chance or nothing taken liberties of or nothing being taken for granted. And I think that's a very important lesson for us, because for the amount of musical insight that an artist like Brinda has, it's very easy for her to get carried away and be inspired by the composition and say, okay, fine, let me see what I can do with this line. But to say, okay, what I can do is for my own space, but here I'm presenting the composition. So how do I present this true to its form, true to the way I have learnt it, true to my legacy, but still keep it relevant and fresh every single time I sing. And I think that is a very important component to why their music remained the way it did and continues to be treasured.
It's also in the way they, I think, passed it on to their disciples and students. They were, I mean, from the various artists that we have interacted with, we've also heard that they were extremely strict about the way somebody learned these compositions from them and the way they presented it every time. So that also talks about the importance that they are giving to Patantara, the discipline, the way of singing, and actually even how you pass it on to the next generation and how they sing it and how it is preserved. I think that's how it has been preserved through the entire lineage in that family. Right from the way they learned it from Dhanama to even Keerthanams that they have learned from Kanchipuram Nayana Pillai or the Shama Shastri Keerthanams they sing, the Mutswami Dikshithar Keerthanam they sing, they are extremely proud and they hold a lot of pride in their Patantaras.
One other very interesting facet of their music is the idea of the note. In today's understanding of what their music means, I think when we think of the note within their music, we always think of oscillations or ornamentations or I think embellishments. But then the beauty of their music and why these ornamentations stood out is, I think, the purity of the plain note. And in many of their renditions, in just I think one plain note or in just I think a Karvai on a Ngantara Gandhara or a Tarasthai Rishabha, it feels so complete. You're inspired by just that one plain note, after which everything else seems to make that much more sense because of the relief of that one note and the purity of that note and the value of how much the sustain on that particular note is. The proportion is impeccable. One other word that you'll hear us mention repeatedly throughout this presentation, like nuance, is I think proportion. Because for somebody with again that much insight, it's very easy for her to expand a raga alapana for 15 or 20 minutes. But then you will never find a recording where she did. It would always be around 5 or 6 minutes, sometimes 7 minutes. But the idea of proportion in terms of which raga to expand around which region, which gamaka in which note in which raga should be at which proportion, I think that was also a constant irrespective of what she sang throughout in a concert or in whatever composition she sang. So I think that also is something that we are going to be paying closer attention to going forward.
Brinda's voice was extremely special. You would have heard us talk about how they project their voice and how they vocalize the gamakas, how they vocalize the swaras. In every modulation, be it speed, be it a jaru, be it a brika, be it a spuritam, be it just plain notes, be it a small subtle bend that maybe she wanted to convey some emotion. I don't know, but everything had clarity in it. The voice was full. I don't know how to say this. For me, I would put it this way: the way the voice was full. The voice, there was nothing false in that voice. Every time the voice came, with every note, with every part of her music, with her singing, it was completely true and full, and there was nothing false about it. It was uniform in every octave. You take the mantrasthai, you take the madhyasthai, you take the tarasthai. The way she gave her voice, the projection of that voice was uniform. The tonality of the voice was uniform. Actually, I would go as far as saying, even if there was a crack, I think she had full control of, the way the voice crackled at a certain point when she sang a Sangati. So it's extremely special, and that is a part of her music. And we cannot discount that. I think that is something that is, it cannot be emulated, imitated, in any way. It's just a part of her character and her music.
Yeah, and I think more often than not, when we think of powerful voices or good voices, the focus always tends to go towards the male voice. But for a female voice to be thought of as powerful, but where the texture of the music is not something that's considered macho in today's understanding of the music, is, I think, a wonderful dichotomy within itself to our understanding of what we think of as powerful music, what we think of as full-throated singing, and what we think of as good voices. And in that way, apart from, of course, her voice being completely aligned to Shruti, her having control over everything she sang, one thing that's very important for us to realize is that in spite of singing such nuanced music, her voice never sounded strained. Whatever she sang never sounded harsh, because the more the usage of the Kampitam normally, the more chances that there are for imperfections or for there to be some harshness, or for there to be some disconnect between two notes, between how they move with each other. But the fact that all of that was seamless in her voice is, I think, all credit to her. And one other thing that we never speak about is that the focus is so much on the music that we say, oh, everyone in that family, sang beautiful music. Yes, they did. But one thing that we do not give Brinda enough credit for is the quality of her voice. We just say, maybe she had a gift of voice. But no, the fact that everyone else in the family learned in a similar way, learned within the same system, learned the similar compositions, means that even if you are entrenched within that music, for your voice to be able to reproduce, recreate the nuances within that music, there are certain things that each individual needs to do to be able to sing that to their satisfaction. And I think she did that, and we must give her credit for that, because I think it's very unfair and a disservice if we just, I think, brush it aside and say, she had the natural gift of voice and whatever she sang sounded beautiful. No, I'm sure as a singer, I know how difficult it is to get one Sangati perfect. So for somebody to be able to do that every time she sang, it is impossible that she did that without a lot of investment of time, hard work, practice, and everything else in place, because of which her voice became what it is. So I think that to be able to acknowledge that is very important, to say that her voice was entirely her own, and because she spent the time that was necessary to hone it.
Yes, of course. And okay, even if you want to concede that she had the gift of voice, to actually harness that voice, to control it, to sing what she has been taught, the way it had to be, the way she heard it, and the way it had to be sung, and the way she wanted to sing it, and the way she wanted to make it her own music, requires a phenomenal amount of work and practice and introspection as to how one wants to use the voice, or how one wants to project it. So yes, rightly said, one can't just dismiss it as having the gift of voice. Yes, even if one has the gift of voice, it is important that credit and acknowledgement is given to the work that has gone behind harnessing that voice in order to produce the music that has been given to us.
So when we spoke about some of the salient features right in the beginning in the introduction, we said Patantara was very important. When we look a little deeper into that, you will find that most of their concerts predominantly revolved around the compositions of the Trinity and the Padams and the Javalis to a large extent. But what is interesting is that even within those compositions, the kind of Tyagaraja compositions they sang, and especially the repertoire of Muthuswami Dikshidhar compositions, and I think Shama Shastri, Subbaraya Shastri, Annasamy Shastri was very distinct and very unique compared to all of the other compositions that we heard in vogue during that time period, from I think between the 40s to the 70s or 80s. Their repertoire was very different. In fact, we hear of so many of their peers coming to them and learning these compositions from them and making it a part of their repertoire. So I think as much as we speak about Patantara and lineage, it's important to acknowledge that so many of the Dikshidhar compositions we have today, like Veena Pustakadharini or all of them, preserved so beautifully and passed on through multiple different sources, is because of that discipline to Patantara that they hold so dearly, because of which they were also so particular about how they taught and how they passed on the same Patantara outside of the family, which is why they believed that that discipline is something that was part of the art and part of their way of life. So when we are looking at Patantara here more specifically, I think this is very important to, I think, first establish.
Yeah, and also with their repertoire, I think their family had an entire repertoire, and not everybody sang in concerts everything from that repertoire. There is T. Vishwanathan, there is Bala Saraswati, T. Mukta, all of them sang, be it Padams, Javalis, Kirtanams, all of them sang a different set of this repertoire. Their repertoire would have been vast and they would have learnt everything, but the fact that she chose to sing a certain section or a portion of that repertoire is pretty special. I don't know, of that family, not just of her, but of that family, where they chose what they had the ability to choose what resonated with them and then present that as their own music.
Yeah, and I think even the Padams and Javalis that Bala Saraswati and Vishwa handled are very different, even within the idea of the Padams and Javalis, which we feel are so limited because of our lack of understanding. We feel that there are only, say, 10 or 15 Padams. No, but their repertoire was vast. Every time you hear different recordings of them, every time a new Padam surfaces, you're like, oh, okay, this was there as well. So which means that the learning was so holistic that it was not towards the intention to wanting to perform. The learning happened because they wanted to learn, and it was passed on to them, and it was their way of life. Simple. What they did with what they learnt is what is special, because each one then found themselves within certain compositions, which then they made their own. In fact, in many of Mukta Ma's solos, if you look at her concert lists, she sung so many songs that she's never sung along with Brindama when the two of them sang together. So each of them also had their own preferences of compositions from their large, I think, repertoire of compositions. So that is a very interesting thing to look at. Of course, many of the compositions that we speak about are synonymous with many of them because of how they've made it their own. And I think that happens only with repeated practice, repeated learning, repeated hearing of somebody else learning the same composition around you, so much so that it is internalized to that point where you don't even have to think about it.
Also, complete awareness of what you want to, present. I mean, the learning happens holistically, completely, but also complete awareness of how you want to present your music and what you want to present makes you introspect and choose from that repertoire, and that's something very interesting, because there are many varnams, kirtanams and javalis and padams that are synonymous with each of them actually. So if you look at, just to give an example, if you look at Tiruvattirur Tyagarajan, you have Bala Saraswati, it's synonymous with Bala Saraswati. You have Padari Vargade, it is, or Janaro, the Javali Janaro, it's synonymous with T. Vishwanathan sir. And you have Pusa Taramu and Velavare, it's actually both Bala Saraswati and T. Mukta sang it, but it's synonymous with them. So each part of that repertoire was taken and made their own by different members of that family, and that actually speaks about their awareness of their own music.
Let's now look at examples of these compositions that we are talking about. We'll just give you a few examples of I think songs that are sometimes still not part of the vast repertoire or the majority of songs that we continue to hear in the concert circuit today. But each of these are special in the way Brinda sang it. If we look at Varnams, you have the Ananda Bhairavi Atatala Varnam, Samini Pai, and you have the Kamalakshi Yedukula Kamboji Varnam also. And I think these two Varnams are synonymous with her because she probably opened with these two more often than the others. Of course, she sung the Shankarabharanam Varnam, she sung the Darbar Varnam, she sung the Begada Varnam, Naiki Varnam, all of these. But I think these two Varnams highlight or I think show us a glimpse into even her choice of Varnams or the choice of the ragas in the Varnams that she chose to pick and sing. Let's just hear maybe a bit of both.
The Tyagaraja Kirtanams that she sang in her concerts, the recordings that we have, are also pretty rare and are not generally heard in every in general concert platform. There are so many short, small kirtanams and in rare ragas also. For example, you have Parulunu Vedanu in Balahamsa, you have Manasa Shri Ramachandrani, Vinave O Manasa, Yemana Dichevo, Dayeju Chutakidi, Kripaju Chutaku Velararama, and examples of so many Tyagaraja Kirtanams that she has presented in her concerts. And
Nenendu Vedakudra, Janaki Ramana, Aparada Mulanurva. There are so many of these compositions where the entire track would be 3 minutes maybe.
Yeah, just like a flash in the middle, but still full of that raga. So when you want to know that raga, you would listen to that rendition of the Kirtanam, and it tells you a lot about.
But I think it's also speaks a lot to intent, because when I'm thinking about it now, more often than not, if it's a 3 or 4 minute Aditala Tyagaraja Swami Kirtana, it's treated within the concert format today as a filler for you to just, I think, increase the tempo and get people to sit up between two pieces or just before the main raga or something like that. But what that also does is that you also want some amount of movement in that, where it gives you the option to be able to sing a quick flash ragam or maybe a few quick swarams or maybe a couple of rounds of quick naraval. But what that does to the composition itself is then it's placed within a certain context of the concert idea. The fact that they sang concerts not with a format meant that these compositions took an entirely different perspective. So in the sense, more often than not, she would sing compositions like this, she would start a concert with a Vinave O Manasa, which we would think twice to do because it's not a very appropriate, within quotes, concert starter, because it neither gives you the first initial momentum, nor is it a somber starting concert. It's somewhere in between, right?
And it's
but
also
then,
tricky to sing swarams.
exactly, for a raga like
yeah.
Vivardhini. But if you are looking at each of these compositions as being their own body of work, rather than you using that body of work to achieve a certain goal, then I think the importance that you place on each of these compositions, whether they are 10 minutes or 7 minutes or 3 minutes or 30 minutes, become the same. And at that point, how you reinterpret and place these compositions in, say, I don't want to call Brinda as a concert, I'm going to say a musical offering. In say a musical offering of say 2 hours is entirely different then, because these compositions are then sang with equal intent as an Akshayalinga Vibho or as a Padam or as a Varnam or as a Javali. So which means that then the intensity of these compositions then yield to only certain Kala Pramanams. You can't push it beyond a certain speed to keep the identity of Balahamsa or Rasali ragas like this intact. And I think that also, I think, is a lesson for us in how to value, I think, music over everything else.
For example, the Dikshita Kirtanams that they sang, Saraswati Manohari, Veena Pustakadharini, Tyagaraja Palaya Sumam, Hastivadanaya in Navaroj, Chintavimakanda, Meenakshi Memudam, Chandram Bhajamanj. You can keep going. They were authorities in Dikshita and Shama Shastri Kirtanams. And not everything was, actually, if you look at their musical presentation, the list of songs that they sing in their presentation, it's a long list of songs. The duration would be about 2.5 hours, the concert duration. But the number of just songs that they present, Kirtanams of Tyagaraja, Mutswami Dikshita, Shama Shastri, Padams, Javalis, interspersed with Manodharmam, but with the same intensity that
and
you
proportion.
would, and proportion, exactly, and proportion is phenomenal.
Yeah. And I think when you also look at the repertoire of Shama Shastri Kirtanams, you have Karuna Judu, Ema Ninne, Subraya Shastri, the entire family, Ninnu Sevinchina, Janani Ninnuina, Nannu Brochutaku, Dalachina Varu, Pahi Shri, Shri Kamakshi, Venkata Shaila Vihara. And each of these songs you truly believe are theirs, right? And more often than not, you will find maybe 5 or 6 or maybe sometimes 10 compositions synonymous with an artist. But the impact that they have had to every composition that they've sung across composers, across Padams, Javalis, Varnams, shows the intensity of their presentation of each of these compositions and their understanding of it, because of which it has the impact that it does. And so I think that's very important for us to look at. We are not going to discuss Padams and Javalis here, because that is going to be a separate section by itself. But if you also look at some of the other composers apart from the Javalis, then you will also see them singing a lot of Patnam Subramania compositions like Brovasa Memide in Gauri Manohari, Paridanamichite, Intakante, Aparada Mulaniyu, Ramayika Nannu Brovarada. And you will also find that a lot of people who learn from them sing so many more of these Ondrayadam Patna Subramania compositions that I am sure even I didn't know existed until they actually sang it. So I think so much of this is a treasure that I think we need to preserve. And similarly, there are so many other special compositions that are one-offs of certain composers, but has become so synonymous with them. If you look at Kantimati in Kalyani or Ekalathilum in Purvi Kalyani, or Vachamago Charundani in Athana. All of these compositions are also again synonymous with them. Even the way they sing Kavava is very unique. Just the beginning of the Ga, we'll come to that at another section. If you even look at Gajavadana, the way they sang Gajavadana was very different, very unique. So, having said all of this, I think one last point I'd like to speak about before we move on to their raga singing is that as much as they learnt compositions in practice as part of their learning, what is also I think important for us to acknowledge is that every time a composition is passed down, especially I think in the system of music that we represent in Carnatic music, what we call the Karna Parampara, or just I think passed down through an oral tradition, what is very important is that each time it's being passed down, it is actually a continuation of a certain legacy, continuation of a different time period, continuation of history that is being passed down. So, keeping this in mind, when you look at the life of a composition, from the time say Muthuswami Dikshidhar or Tyagaraja or Shama Shastri composed it maybe 250-300 years ago, the fact that some of these compositions have travelled through time, through practice is I think phenomenal. But what is also important here is that every person who passes it down makes sure that it is their responsibility to pass it down the way they inherited it, so that that legacy remains intact. Of course, the sound of the overall music, the sound or the aesthetic of the genre at one particular time period may differ from the past, but the interpretation of that composition within each of those time periods cannot change. The way those swaras are interpreted is different, but the Sangati itself, or I think the overall idea of each of these composition itself need to be intact, and we see that followed very strictly in the way they sang, they learnt and they passed it down. And the reason I'm saying this is because when we look at the histories of many of these ragas, a lot of things that we've changed or whitewashed today remains in their music and they hold it with great pride. For example, if you look at the way they sing Chandram Bhajamanasa, today you will find everybody start Chandram Bhajamanasa with the Periya Rishabham. But the way they sing, just like how it is notated in the Sangeeta Sampradaya Pradarshani and just like how Asaveri existed 250-300 years ago, the value of the Rishabham of where they sing is almost on the Chinna Rishabham, which means that then there is some amount of historicity to the way they sing certain things as well, in terms of how they've learnt it and how they've retained it. And I think that is very special. And if we look at more examples of that, if we look at Sri Rajagopala in Saveri, the way they sing the first phrase, the Sanida, where the knee is much lower, almost on the Kaishiki Nishadam, I think that also points to a certain point in history from the past. Similarly, if you look at the way they sing Samajavaragamana, there is always a confusion of whether Hindolam was Varamu, Varamu was Hindolam, whether certain compositions the Da has taken a different form, etc. The way they sing their Samajavaragamana is purely with the bigger Da, and they also sing Kalpana Swaram to it. And similarly, if you look at certain other compositions, certain Devagandhari compositions, the way they use the Gandharam, and similarly if you look at say Vinata Sutavahana, they will have certain Sangatis that I am sure in grammar they knew was probably not in place or not acceptable to that period. But the fact that it existed in a previous period and was passed down to them makes it that much more precious. And I think that is something that we all need to take from the fact that there is a slight suggestion of an Antara Gandharam in Vinata Sutavahana, which is Jayantasena Raga with Sadharana Gandharam. Or if we look at say their renditions of certain compositions of Purvi Kalyani, the knee will be of a much different value, the knee will be way more obvious, the Niriga phrase will be used, and in fact many of the Ananda Bhairavi phrases that we don't sing today because we think doesn't sound right, you will actually find them singing in their Viritams, you will actually find them using strains of that in composition. So I think all of these little nuggets of history that is part of a composition is what I think makes the composition alive, is what makes the idea of the composition a living being, and why it matters to actually transfer it and pass it on to the next generation. If the composition was not alive and did not have this much content, history, culture and social, I think, relevance to that, through meaning, through so many different layers, then I don't see the point of us singing compositions in concerts anymore. Which is why I think this is so important for us to understand from, and for us to also realize that Patantara is far more than just learning what we are taught and repeating it. There are so many of these layers that contribute to what makes Patantara a living body of work, and why it's important for us to preserve that.
If you look at Brinda's approach to raga singing, it's extremely phrase based. It is extremely context oriented, gamaka oriented, and by context I mean it takes into account the history of the raga, the context in which it is presented with respect to that certain composition, the context in which the gamaka lies in relationship to what comes before and what comes after. Why I am saying is that even the way they handled ragas like Gauri Manohari, ragas like Harikamboji, which are not inherently phrase based ragas per se, the way they've handled it is extremely phrase based. You can actually see a certain movement, a development of phraseology even in these ragas, in the way they've handled raga singing. There is a beautiful recording of her singing Gauri Manohari Alapna before Prova Samayamide, and if you listen to that raga, the way she handles the Gauri Manohari, there is a certain history to it. The Rigamapada, when she the phrase, when she sings the Rigamapadani phrase, it's you can see that the way the movement happens in that phrase when she sings it is taken a lot from the Raga Bhairavi, which is an older raga, which is a phrase based raga, and the approach of that phrase based idea in a raga, in a scalar raga like Gauri Manohari, to then give it a Carnatic sound, a way of singing it phraseologically, and to give it a certain development which then complicates the presentation of that raga is something beautiful.
No, I think it's complicated because of how we've simplified, or how we understand Gauri Manohari today. What we've done is we've simplified ragas as scales and we've retained them there so that it's much easier work for us. Let's be honest, it's much easier to sing a scalar raga in comprehension than a Rakti raga which is phrase based. So what we tend to do is, if it's not an older raga, most of the ragas that she handled are, say, ragas like Atana, Surati, Anandabhairavi, Mukhari, Varali, Begada, Danyasi, Purvi Kalyani, Saveri, and so many others, require a certain understanding of each of them individually. You need to over time learn phrases of each of these ragas separately. But if suppose there were another set of ragas that existed as a scale, and if you, let's say, mastered how to sing one particular scale, it is much more easier to apply the same logic to other scales and to sing those other scales as ragas, than to see, okay, fine, let me take Gauri Manohari for example. It has a certain Ri, a certain Ga, a certain Ma. Rather than looking at this as something that I can take from Karahara Priya. What about if I looked at these, the relationship between these three notes as from Bhairavi? Or what if I looked at the relationship between the Padani in Keeravani as the relationship as how I would look at and say a raga like Maya Malavagaula, which also has existed slightly before. Then would that change the perspective of how we look at or how we explore or sing these Scalar ragas? Very simply put, the way she handles the Madhyamam in that Gauri Manohari as a Kampitam is unheard of. We would never find a Kampita Gamakam on a Madhyamam in Gauri Manohari today because we look at it as Sarigama Padanisa, Sanitapama Garisa, where the Ma is not the Nyasa note for Gauri Manohari. So we'd hear a lot around Ri, a lot around Pa, a lot around Sa. So the Ma is almost a passing note or a turn note. But how do you give relevance to the other notes and not just highlight certain notes in a raga like Gauri Manohari? And she's also done this with ragas like Latangi, where you take the idea of Kalyani, the movement of Kalyani, but you reinterpret it through, say, a vision of Pantvarali. I am, again, the way I say this sounds very crude because it's the way I have related to it when I wanted to understand why Latangi sounds like this and not the way I am used to hearing it today. But I think what is important is that every phrase that she sings is motivated by a certain understanding of the way notes interact with each other. And that is not raga specific or that is not idea specific where it happens only in certain regions. No. If suppose it's a combination of certain notes, the aesthetic sound of those notes come together a certain way in her mind. And this coming together happens with the knowledge and the sound of older ragas. So the way these older ragas has influenced the way she sings these newer ragas, and I think this is a great case study for us to see if this is workable in many of the other scales that we sing today. So how would say a raga like Vagadishwari sound? If suppose the Ma and the Ni had a slight movement the way it does in Hari Kamboji, would then that change the perception of how that Ri in Vagadishwari itself sounds? This is something that we can learn from older ragas and from artists like Brinda who use that knowledge to further their own explorations of the unexplored. And I think that's where we are today because we want to constantly explore newer avenues. And I think rather than trying to do that in an easier fashion, yes, and I do stick my name behind it, I think it's far more difficult to do something like this because it then becomes that much more complex to be able to figure out. But once you figure it out, I think the value that has in the way you take it forward is far more immense. So I think that idea of raga knowledge overall has influenced so much of her music, and we see that in her raga alapanas and ragas like this. Let's listen to both of these types of ragas. Let's listen to maybe a Sahana or a Danyasi, and then let's listen to her Gauri Manohari or maybe Keeravani or Latangi. So from the ragas that we listen to now, you would see how Gauri Manohari moves and the possibilities of the jarus and how the raga takes an entirely different form when you apply different olden day Gamaka logics to a scale. Similarly, we listen to a Dhanyasi also. What is beautiful about Brinda's idea of Dhanyasi is that rather than it being looked at as Sagamapa Nisa, the way she would use the Nishada or the way she would use the Rishabha on the way down or even on the way up sometimes, the relationship of the knee and the re, the relationship of how the ma and the knee works and the weight of the ma and the knee. You will very rarely hear a plain or a flatter ma or a knee where most of the times it would be with a kampita. But the way we hear Dhanyasi today is a very different sound to the Dhanyasi that Brinda sang in. But then when you look at the compositions she sang in Dhanyasi, Ittane Tulambarama, or if you saw her singing Dalachinavaru, the way the Dhanyasi exists within that composition is very close to how she sings the raga. So the movement of the ga, the saga or ma, ni, all of those make sense within that particular context. So to understand the movement of these notes in a raga like Dhanyasi, and many of the times she would sing Panipa also, even though if you're looking at it from a Swaram logic, it is Panidapa. Or if you are looking at the jarus that exist in compositions, a jaru from the male sa to the ga, saga does not exist. But then she uses ideas like that beautifully. So in terms of just visualizing a raga through the compositions that you've learnt and then building on that, and I think forming ideas is beautiful. And one thing about the raga alapana singing from the two ragas that we just heard is that what we understand of as flow in alapana singing is very different from what we hear from Brinda singing. What we understand of flow today is either if it's a series of fast phrases built one after the other where there's a gradual progression, or we think of as flow as, say, if suppose on Kamboji we are on the Tarasthai Gandhara and you keep highlighting the Gandhara as a karve and you keep singing phrases around the Gandhara, you feel a sense of flow. And let me just think of what I'm saying. You feel a sense of flow. Whether it actually is a flow is a very different question altogether, because the moment you are highlighting one note constantly as a karve, whether the idea of your raga has a flow, the fact that the karve is a constant that you keep coming back and showing gives the listener the feel of it having a certain flow. But in raga alapanas of Brinda, you will never find her use one note as a nyasa or as a landing point. There are no notes that are constants that she builds around. Her raga alapanas keep moving. It's like a moving body where you don't know at which point she'll be in which octave, but when you listen to it as a whole composite structure, every phrase makes sense one after the other. But when we sit down to actually sing, it sometimes feels like you're trying to go all over the place with no direction. And that is also because of the way we've been trained to listen to and think of the Raga Alapana today, which has to be a step by step progression. But if you were to look at Raga as just a picture, without these rules and regulations in place, then where do you start a Raga Alapana? On which note do you start? Are you allowed to sing only a certain Kala Pramana if suppose the Raga demands only that? Or do we force ourselves to sing multiple Kala Pramanas even if the Raga's demand does not require it, because we are used to doing it? We sing slow, we sing a Madhyama Kalam, we sing fast phrases, we sing Brigas, we do all of this within a Raga irrespective of whether the Neelambari requires it or irrespective of whether some other Raga actually demands that. But when you look at her Raga Alapanas, you will find that predominantly most of them stick to a certain Laya, a certain Kala Pramana. Most of them stick to a certain meter, where within that you will see some modulations in a drop in speed or slightly faster phrases, or I think run sangadis or sweeps across octaves. But the overall Kala Pramanam of her Alapana will still be a constant, in which these small modulations will be there. So just as much as her music itself is nuanced, the Kala Pramanam variations even within a Raga Alapana are that much more nuanced, where you actually don't realize it. By the time she's finished a Ragam, you feel complete. But actually what she's done with it has literally gone with the flow of where the Raga takes her. And every time a Raga like Purvi Kalyani takes her somewhere else, and that's the beauty of it. And the moment you lead the Raga take where you want to explore and not have a definite idea of where you are going to explore and expect the Raga to be there, I think that changes the perspective of what an Alapana itself is.
The Alapana that we just heard, the Danyasi Alapana that we just heard, there's one phrase that the way she comes back to the Panchamam, with the Pa, whenever she goes up and comes down, that phrase that she sings, there is some magic over there in the way she vocalizes that phrase.
Yeah, I still have not figured it out
what it is.
today.
Yeah, I mean, we listened to it together. I remember, and you told me about it. But
and
after that, trying
so many
to
of us
listen to
have
it
tried
and
to sing it, it just doesn't sound the same.
at all. That's the work and the speciality of that voice that we spoke about before. But yeah, the way, and every time she sings that phrase in that Alapna, it will sound exactly the same. So
yeah, and especially in that Danyasi also, you will find her sing phrases like Niri, from Ni to Ri, using the Sa as a Varja. And when we think of Varja, we always think of ragas like Kalyani or ragas like Todi, where it's much more easier to do, but you would never think of that in a raga like Danyasi. But there are, in almost every raga that she sung, she uses a lot of Panchama Varja, Shadja Varja phrases, which only add to the beauty of it and not actually give you a different sound altogether, which I think is also a very difficult thing to do.
It's not just a permutation combination of swaras. I mean, it's a certain movement and an aesthetic of that raga that is brought about. Let's listen to a Kalyani Alapna now.
la la
The Alapna that you just heard is the way she's handled Kalyani in this Alapna is just phenomenal. Generally, when we sing Kalyani, I especially, when I heard this Alapna, didn't expect, a certain sound of Kalyani that came out in that Alapna. There were so many Varja phrases. Of course, the way she sung the Gandharam, the way she's handled the phrases of Kalyani, extremely Carnatic and aesthetic. I want to say that the sound is extremely Carnatic. There was not even 1 ounce of a certain, Yamuna Kalyani or Hamir Kalyani or any of
the sisters.
These influences that came into the Alapna. But you will see that there is a Gandharam that is been handled in a manner that is in a flat manner. In Kalyani, generally the Gandharam is replete with Kampita Gamaka, but in this Alapna you will see that there is a Gandharam that is flat, and there is a small, like a hint of a certain Kampita which actually hints to a movement. You will also see that the Nishadam, the Nishada that is also handled, there is a flat handling of Nishada in the Kalyani Alapana, and that entire handling of Nishada, with Nishada being flat and not close to Sa with the Kampita Gamaka, was something that I didn't expect in Brinda Alapna of Kalyani. And that just shows a certain conviction in the Carnatic sound that they had, that they could make whatever idea or sound that they wanted to present at that point in time sound extremely Carnatic. That's the conviction in their learning and in their projection of the Carnatic sound in whatever Alapana that they sang, in however they sang the raga.
Yeah, and what's beautiful also is that the way she uses that flat knee is also very octave based, and when she begins the Alapana, she uses a lot more of that in the lower octave, below the Sa. So in a certain sense, it sets up a certain mood of the way the Re and the Ga move, because all of the other notes in the way she sings Kalyani are moving. So especially when the Shadjas, Varja and those phrases, the only note that remains flat is the knee. But then as she moves up and moves to the Tarasthai Shadja, the knee takes an entirely different role based on the octave and based on the context, which I think is great. And the Ga, the way it's handled in the start of the Alapana, to how she hits that flat Ga in the Tarasthai Gandharam to establish that, is not something that we would ever do in Kalyani, at least in the way we understand it today. We always think Kalyani has to, that Gandhara has to have that movement and constantly suggest that movement. But for somebody like her, who we think of as somebody who sings more movements than what we are used to or what we think is normal, to hit these flat notes but to retain that very chaste, almost a very rugged quality of Kalyani that she sings in Kantimati as a composition. And what is also interesting to note is the 5 or 6 Kantimati recordings of her singing that we have. Every time she sung that composition, she sung an Alapana before it. But for most other compositions, you will find sometimes she sings the Alapana, sometimes she doesn't. But I have not come across a single recording where she sung Kantimati without an Alapana. So does the composition inspire her to expand on the raga before it, or does she want to get into a certain mode to be able to sing that magnum opus of a composition? It could be any number of things, but the fact that that exists is interesting for us to think about.
Venkata Sailami Venkata Sailami
If you look at the context of the influences of either Hamir Kalyani or Yamuna Kalyani coming into the Kalyani Alapna that they sing, let's look at the converse. When you hear her sing Venkateshela Vihara, Hamir Kalyani, you will actually see a lot of influence of Kalyani in that Hamir Kalyani that she presents. The way she sings the Kampita Gamaka in Hamir Kalyani for that composition Venkateshela Vihara, to actually make that raga Carnatic.
Okay.
It kind of gives the sound of that raga a certain Carnaticity.
I have a slightly different opinion on that. I think because of how we've understood Hamir Kalyani today, the moment there's movement on some of its notes, we automatically think of it as an influence of Kalyani sometimes. But what is interesting is that if Hamir Kalyani, like say like Behag or Sindhu Bhairavi, these ragas that we've borrowed has become our own within this system, then automatically certain notes, swaras begin to take certain movements.
Correct. So that also, so like we said for Gauri Manohari, which takes on from an older raga. I don't know because we are singing a raga that is borrowed from Hindustani, for the lack of a better term, Hindustani music. We would also, maybe there is a certain application of the way you would handle swaras in Kalyani that has been, that has been kind of transferred over here in the way you handle swaras for Hamir Kalyani.
Yeah, for
or
sure.
Yamuna Kalyani.
But what is interesting to note is that even if she sings Ngadi Nipai or any of the other Yamuna Kalyani Javalis or even Venkateshela Vihara, the movement never makes it seem like it is Kalyani. Like those movements within Hamir Kalyani still make the raga sound as a separate entity by itself.
Of course, it's an influence that I'm talking about. Yeah.